Okay, well, welcome everyone to this new monthly webinar series that we are hosting. Appreciate everyone who registered and signed up, and also those who are listening to the recording. My name is Ryan Mead, and I'm joined by my colleague Chris Conway today. We are part of Hay Hill Advisors, and we won't get too much into our background. You can go to our website and read our bios if you'd like some more. But in summary, Chris and I are both lawyers, consultants, and law professors. And since we are lawyers and we're with the firm Mead, Roach, and Ellis, I have to let everybody know that the material today is not legal advice, it's educational material. But the topic of our series will be the topic of our presentation today is making the coverage analysis usable. So if we go on to the next slide, just a little bit on what we're going to do here. So we're beginning a brand new series of webinars on clinical research billing, or CRB, as is often abbreviated. If you are signed up for this webinar, you will receive notification of others unless you opt out. And the webinars will be recorded. In case you missed the live session, we will send around a link either later tonight or first thing tomorrow morning. You'll all receive a link. And we'll be hosting the webinars on a monthly basis. To start off, we're going to be doing some a little bit more frequent than monthly, and we'll also be posting some ad hoc short videos just to get back in the swing of things. And you'll get an announcement after this session on the dates for our upcoming webinars. From a content perspective of and how we're going to run this format from a format wise, we plan on 50 minutes of content and 10 minutes of questions. Now, this is a webinar platform, so everybody should be on mute except Chris and me. But you can write questions into the chat box or into the Q&A box. And please, by all means, write any questions that you want. We will cover the questions at the end of the material. We won't mention your name or your institution. So, don't worry about that. And we hope to get to as many questions as we can. And then moving on to the next slide. This is an overview of what we want to cover today. So the title is Making the Coverage Analysis Usable. And before I get into these parts, I just want to give an important point, and that is that although this series is about clinical research billing, and we're going to be discussing a lot of billing rules, laws, regulations, we're going to be talking about risk. Today, we're not going to be talking too much about actual billing rules. We're going to start at the basics, and that is the basics of the format of the coverage analysis. And many people on this webinar today, you're interacting with research billing or the coverage analysis many different ways. And this is a challenge in trying to teach research billing because people are often listening in to training and material that it is, and then they're part of a process, and not everybody does everything. So we're going to try to use building blocks in this series by starting with some basic concepts. And one of the concepts is how to manage risk in research billing. The coverage analysis is that principal tool for managing risk, though many of you might interact with the coverage analysis in different ways. People on the webinar listening in today might be building the coverage analysis. You might be building calendars in CTMSs. You might be building calendars inside of a billing system. You might be using the coverage analysis for budgeting. You might be using it to scrub claims, as in separate charges for research patients. And you might be using the coverage analysis for auditing the accuracy of billing. let's say if you're in compliance. And there's 5, 10, 20 other ways you might be using the coverage analysis. But here's the important point. Everybody listening in here is likely using the coverage analysis, and the coverage analysis needs to be usable. So here's what we're going to cover. We're going to do design theory of the basic principle of form follows function, which applies to anything that's being designed. And we'll explain how that applies to a coverage analysis and how function is primary in a design. And then the second section is, of course, this begs the question of what is the function of a coverage analysis? And then number 3, in the third section, we're going to make a distinction between 2 approaches to coverage analysis formatting. And I think this also goes to process as well. What is driving the CA will impact process. So we often see a CTMS-driven coverage analysis, and we often see a revenue cycle-driven coverage analysis. They're not mutually exclusive. These are 2 prototype approaches. Sometimes there are compromises and there are hybrids that need to occur. But we're going to make these distinctions. Neither of them is right or wrong. They're just different approaches. Then we're going to get to 7 practical tips to assess the coverage analysis usability and questions. Okay, so with that, let's dive in with form follows function. So we have here a hypothetical, and I'm just going to describe the hypothetical. I'm not going to explain it. Just think about it as we talk through the material. So imagine you create and install voice-activated lighting in your house. Some of you may already have this. My mother has this in her house with for some of the rooms with a particular device. I won't mention the device, or perhaps that device by name will pop off in some of your and start talking to some of you as the device hears the name. But you can figure out what device she uses. So there are benefits to a voice-activated lit house. It's convenient, it's accessible, it's modern. It's the age of the Jetsons is here with all of this technology. There are also some downsides. The voice commands don't always work smoothly. The setup is complicated and changes with operating system updates. And if your Wi-Fi goes down, you lose control of your lights. And anybody who's going to do a voice-activated lit house has to weigh the benefits and the downsides. Okay, now just keep that in mind as we go forward. Now let's talk about this design principle of form follows function. And one quick prefatory note that I should have mentioned slightly earlier, is many of you that are listening might think that we're talking about you as we're going through this deck. And believe me, we're not. If you think that we are talking about your CTMS system or your billing system or your processes, that's probably evidence that you are experiencing something that most everyone in the country is experiencing right now. And that is over-formatting of coverage analyses. It's something, the reason we're kicking off this series with this topic and discussing how form follows function is because it's the thing which I think most organizations are struggling with the most right now, is how to get their process efficient, get the formatting clean, and to get the process to work. So this design principle at the very top, this is just basic to all design. How something is designed needs to keep in mind how it is used. So imagine a building. A building might be beautiful, but what use is a building if it's not functional? So, of course, buildings, it's great to have buildings. It's beautiful. It's better for life. It's more enjoyable. And there are some buildings which are beautiful that don't have a function. Well, those beautiful buildings without a function, that's called a monument. And they actually do have a function. They have a public function. Monuments have all sorts of wonderful functions in community life. And the aesthetics of a monument, the beauty of a monument adds to that public function. But there's that rule for monuments. Monuments are not very good at hosting offices or manufacturing plants. The Washington Monument is an incredible structure, but imagine if you had to climb up all those stairs every day to get to your office. That's not very functional. So function, efficiency, utility of the building, and yes, aesthetics are important, but there's a common sense balance. Buildings should be functional first, and then their beauty can be explored. Now, if we move on, imagine a building, keeping on with this theme, that has a fantastic goal. And in theory, it will be very functional. In fact, we can even say that once it's built, it's going to be the best building for working in. It's going to be incredibly efficient. But so much time is spent on the beautiful flourishes that the building is never finished. This obviously begs a question about what has been achieved by a building that is never finished, where people can't move in to the office space or to the living space. Or maybe by the time it's finished, all the features are outdated and the purpose for which it was built and designed isn't needed anymore. So, we can see this in lots of aspects of our life. So how does this apply to coverage analyses? Well, coverage analyses are not beautiful in the way a building can be. Some of you might think they're beautiful. I'll leave that to everybody's individual aesthetic taste. But a variation of beauty can be found in a coverage analysis, which comes into play in consistency and orderliness. So consistency and orderliness within a coverage analysis are good qualities. They're essential qualities, I would say, for a coverage analysis to have. But the pursuit of correct formatting at all costs can in the end be counterproductive. So we want to be consistent, we want to be orderly, but we also have to explore what consistency means. Doesn't always mean coming to the same conclusion, because there are a lot of variables in coverage analysis. And orderliness, well, what is the purpose of orderliness? The purpose of orderliness is it goes back to the design principle. It's for function. It's so that it can be used and understood. Coverage analyses also have another function besides being used, in that they preserve reasoning and arguments in case there is an audit or you need to justify a decision. But there always has to be balance. There must be a balance between consistency and orderliness with the substance of the coverage analysis that produces a usable tool. If the coverage analysis isn't usable, what have you achieved? And over formatting can lead to bottlenecks, slower time to activation overall, not just in getting the coverage analysis done, but it can lengthen your TTA, time to activation, which everybody is concerned about these days. Over formatting can lead to rework, and it can also create a confusing billing tool, particularly when the designers end up being very focused on the orderliness, but disconnected to whether the orderliness actually helps the end user use the coverage analysis, or even those who might have to defend or justify the coverage analysis. Does it go too far? And folks can sometimes get very caught up in the process of developing the coverage analysis, and it's understandable. There's lots of pressure in research billing, and there's lots of volume. Most everybody listening here has dozens, hundreds of, sometimes thousands for some of you listening, research studies and coverage analyses you need to process every year. So, but we can't forget about taking a beat sometimes and thinking about whether the balance is right. Are we putting the emphasis on the right purposes of the coverage analysis? Are we putting the emphasis on the usability and the end users' use of the CA? So this, of course, leads us to what is the function of a coverage analysis? And I'll turn this over to Chris for this section.
All right, thanks, Brian. Yes, so let's now switch to discussing the function of a coverage analysis. So the primary function of a CA is to guide accurate billing to insurance and to prevent overpayments from insurance during clinical research. The CA can have other uses within the organization, but this is the primary function as a tool. It is a risk mitigation billing tool. The CA synthesizes a lot of information. It synthesizes the protocol, the informed consent form, the CTA and the budget, and Medicare's billing rules to create a tool to be used during claims review or claims scrubbing. So this is a lot of information that needs to be included and captured and considered within the coverage analysis. Because this is a lot of information, the form and readability of the end product is important to its usability during claims scrubbing. We do want to say a CA is not required by law or Medicare rule. There is no rule written down by the government that says you shall create a coverage analysis. But a coverage analysis is a smart and prudent thing to do from a risk mitigation perspective. I put it this way, there is no law that says you have to use an umbrella when it's raining, but using an umbrella when it's raining is the smart and prudent thing to do if you'd like to avoid getting wet. Because a coverage analysis is not required by law, it also follows that there is no one true format that is required. And there, in truth, is no one true format that will automatically eliminate all risk. There's a lot of human intervention during the clinical research billing process generally, and that opens us up to screw-ups every now and again, because to err is to be human. So eliminating all risk is really not a feasible goal. Just like how using an umbrella isn't going to ensure that you remain 100% dry. But a usable CA minimizes the risk of presenting a false claim to insurance and receiving an overpay, in the same way that an umbrella might minimize the wetness to your shoes and the bottom of your pants. A CA and umbrella both cannot eliminate all risk, but they can minimize the risk when created and used correctly. Now we'd like to briefly discuss insurance and clinical research billing. Except in one state, which is Maryland, no health insurer pays the charges on a claim. The charges are separate and distinct from payment. I'd like to explain it this way. If you're in a hotel room, there is going to be a posted sign, which is usually on the back of the door or in the closet, that says the maximum per night cost for that room. And it's usually something crazy. It's like $10,000 to $15,000. So that's the maximum per night cost for that room that is set. But you don't actually pay that maximum per night room rate. That maximum per night room rate is establishing a ceiling for the cost of that room. And what you pay is going to be a lot less than that maximum rate. And this is what healthcare services payments is like. The charges are like that maximum room rate sign. It establishes a ceiling for cost, but it does not necessarily reflect payment for those services. Actual payment from insurance is different than a charge and is determined by two methods. For commercial insurance, the payment rate associated with the code, a CPT code or a DRG code, is negotiated between the insurance company and the institution. And again, that charge rate is the ceiling. It's going to be the institution's first initial offer. But the agreed upon payment rate is going to be whittled down and lowered during the process of negotiations. For government health plans, the payment rate for a particular code is imposed by fiat. So the government mandates that this is what we're paying. And that mandated payment amount is always 100% lower. It is always going to be lower than the charge rate. So payment is different than a charge. and payment occurs via either a contract with a commercial insurer or by law, by fiat, by the government. Another truth about insurance and clinical research billing. It's important to know and recognize that not everything that is covered by insurance is actually paid by insurance. It's very common to have insurance contracts or insurance law cover a service, but not actually pay for the service. This actually happens all the time. Payment for services can vary by insurance plan, by geographical region, by even the other services that are presented on the claim with a particular service. Some insurance payments are global. So, for example, a physical exam payment made on the same day as lab charges is meant to be a global payment that covers the costs of those labs. But what you end up with on a remittance is payment for the physical exam line. So you receive money for that line, and then you'll have $0 in payment for the labs. This doesn't mean that the labs were denied by insurance. Those labs are still covered by insurance, and it was fine for you to bill insurance for them. It just means that the institution did not receive payment for them, and this happens all the time. So keeping this in mind, using a coverage analysis and coverage principles in a CA is a way of applying consistent principles across multiples of studies at an organization. But coverage in and of itself does not guarantee payment or study financial viability, because coverage does not always mean payment. Next, let's talk about billing codes and clinical research billing. We like to say that research protocols are general, but patient care is individual. What we mean by this is research protocols are crafted by the sponsor with a general patient in mind with a specific disease. And the protocol provides a PI, a roadmap to follow when caring for a patient enrolled in a clinical trial. But in reality, when the patient is in the room, the PI's principal obligation is to treat the actual individual patient in a clinical trial, and all individuals are different. So if Ryan and I have the same disease and we are enrolled on the same clinical trial, our actual care, and what the charges and the payments that are going to come from that is going to be different. Because Ryan and I are different, we have different bodily systems, we have different medical histories. So our presentation to our doctor is going to be different, and our patient care is going to be individual to us, even if it is following a general roadmap of that research protocol. So what this means is it is impossible to predict all of the codes and charges for a patient either inside or outside of a research study ahead of time. All circumstances cannot be contemplated and planned for before they happen in medicine. That's just the way this works. Every patient is an individual. Every patient is different, and things change rapidly. PIs care for actual individual patients and not general hypothetical patients. So trying to guess ahead of time of everything that's going to happen or everything that could happen is a losing game. So I'll end this section with a bit of a reality check on coverage analyses. So CAs are starter tools. CAs are not algorithmic tools because healthcare professionals do not treat people as algorithms. They treat people as individuals. CAs cannot accommodate all possibilities for all patients while maintaining their function, because this is a road to infinity. There is no end. Trying to guess everything that could potentially happen to every potential patient, there is no limit to that. On a practical level, predicting the future for all patients and what they're going to need in the future is unknowable, because the future is fundamentally unknowable. And where this can lead us is that if we're over formatting our coverage analysis to try to accommodate these all possibilities for all patients, you're not only not going to practically reach that level, because it is a level that you cannot reach. It is a road to infinity, but you're also going to lead to a lot of clutter. And a lot of clutter can lead to a less usable billing tool. I'm sure that we've all had the experience of opening up an email and we're shocked by the amount of text that's in the email. The email reads like it's 10 pages out of a Dickens novel or something. There's just a lot. There's blocks and blocks of text. And what is our reaction when we open that email? At least my reaction is like, wow, I'm not going to read all that. Maybe I'll skim it. Maybe I'll from skimming it, I'll glean the important points, but that's a lot for me to sift through, and I have a short amount of time here, and I've got other things to do. So that's maybe not the best way to format an email. Maybe just the bullet point high levels would have been better, because I can conceive of that. I can ingest bullet points and high level points a lot better than I can a whole block of text. CAs are kind of like that. Sometimes the more complex and the more information that you put into something, the less the end user actually gets out of it. And I think this happens all the time. Sometimes simplicity is the best way to convey even complex amounts of information, because simplicity and is easier for us to understand than a lot of clutter and a lot of complexity. So with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Ryan to discuss some of these different approaches to coverage analyses.
Great. Thanks, Chris. And for those of you who know us, of course, Chris was talking about how I write emails at the end. But in all seriousness, as an example, I personally do have this tendency of writing very long emails with a lot of explanation, and that sometimes backfires on me, because whoever I'm writing that to, it takes a long time to read through it. So I've personally I try. I don't do this always very successfully, but if I've written a long email, I'll let it sit there, but then I'll go back through it and then try to whittle it down, try to condense it, or if that's very challenging, I'll write an executive summary where I'll put at the top of the email something that's very short that people can digest. And that's just there's lots of different examples of this, but coverage analyses fall into this trap as well. Is that as we're developing coverage analyses, and Chris and I we've worked on many thousands of coverage analyses, and you want to convey something. You want to make sure folks are understanding this or that. Sometimes it gets a little, like my email writing, it gets a little out of control, and there's so much there that it's not usable for the recipient. But back to that design principle, form follows function, right? Like, what's the function of the email? It's to communicate. If I'm not communicating what I need to in that email, it doesn't matter if I've written a beautiful novel in that email. It didn't serve its purpose. Same thing with the coverage analysis. And in this section, what really can influence heavily the coverage analysis are other factors that that come into play in developing the coverage analysis, particularly the platforms that you're using. So we like to make a distinction in two different approaches. As I mentioned at the top of the session, these are prototypes, and neither of them is right or wrong. There does, though, tend to be formats that look a bit different on these two, and both can have their challenges. So the first one, a CTMS-driven CA. If the most important goal for a CA is to have a robust calendar to track when protocol-required services occur, and to provide information that approximates the multitude of possibilities that can occur during each research visit in hopes of a potential integration with a site's billing system, then that's what we call a CTMS-driven CA. And most CTMSs are very similar in this way. There are lots of different functions and variability between the many systems that are out there. But a classic function of a CTMS is to have a calendar that replicates the schedule of events. Now, that calendar has a lot of different purposes for the CTMS. And that can be data analytics. It can be to track the date for every single lab that was done. It can be a reminder to the study coordinator or study team to check in with the PI on this needs to be done or that needs to be done. Those things that I just described, that's not related to billing. Those are legitimate functions that an organization might want to use a CTMS for, but those aren't related to billing. There are efforts to try and get that calendar and all that data that I've just described and try to push it over into a billing system to try to separate charges, depending upon what systems you're using. That has some a little bit of success, and others are, it might work in some organizations, but it doesn't work in others. It's very individuated to the organization. But if all of that is happening in your CTMS and the CTMS calendar is being used for data analytics that aren't related to billing, or what's going on in the calendar is exploding and getting larger and larger because it's trying to be an all possibilities calendar, that's a CTMS driven coverage analysis. It's just a reality. Those coverage analyses will be more complex. They will be longer, and it will take longer to develop them. Now, if in your coverage analysis on the second point on this slide, if the most important goal for a CA is to provide starter information for the charge separation team to direct line item services to either health insurance or a study fund, then that's what we call the revenue cycle driven CA. A key point here in a revenue cycle driven CA is that it's not an all possibilities coverage analysis. It's a starter. And the revenue, and this goes to what Chris was talking about on how health insurance, just some basics of health insurance and the charge capture system. There's a very, very big difference between professional billing and hospital billing. When physicians bill their professional billing, there's usually only one code. Every so often, there's a couple of codes that can be used. So I don't want to say it's always one code, but there are very, very few codes to represent the service that the physician provided. It's very different for hospital billing, as I think most everybody here knows. One visit to a hospital can produce 50 line items of services and charges, where the doctor's only billing one code, one line item. The hospital, it all breaks out. Now, there's a reason for that, and it has to do quite a bit with what's called the cost report and the cost report process. And we won't get into that here. Just know that it is extremely rare for a patient to be registered for a hospital visit, any hospital visit, and there just to be one code. And that's a bit of what Chris was talking about. Not only because all of the services that occur and supplies often get scanned and are separate codes, but what the patient needs is different from patient to patient, and that happens inside of a research study as well. So that's why a revenue cycle driven CA accepts the principle that a CA is a starter for the team that will be doing charge separation. One of the things that we've found in that in trying to make this distinction between a CTMS-driven CA and a revenue cycle-driven CA is that many organizations, once they realize that these are two very different approaches, they often develop a hybrid because it can be a relief sometimes because to realize that the best CAs, the most usable CAs, the most functional CAs provide starter information to the revenue cycle team. rather than an algorithm, as Chris talked about, or achieving an all possibilities situation, because the road to infinity is a good way to put the all possibilities CA. So moving on to the next slide, one approach, CTMS driven, revenue cycle driven, neither is right or wrong, but they are trying to achieve different functions. You might be doing a CTMS driven CA, and that may be what the organization has committed to. One tip here I would say is to recognize it is a road to infinity unless you just call it at some point. There's nothing wrong with those CTMS CAs, but there does need to be some balance put in there and a decision on when is enough risk managed, because you'll never eliminate risk and you'll never get all possibilities there. So a research institution needs to determine the primary function it is trying to achieve by creating the coverage analyses. And when we say by creating the coverage analyses, now we are talking about the process of creating the coverage analysis. What is going into the end result there? Is the coverage analysis, are you thinking about conveying information to the revenue cycle team as starter information to direct charges appropriately, or are you thinking about data analytics? And if you're thinking about the data analytics that could come from it, that's fine. That's great. But you probably want to think about that as secondary. And the most important thing is that the coverage analysis is usable to manage that risk. If it's usable to manage the risk, but you end up spending most of your time on the data analytics, it might be like the building I described at the beginning, where it's a beautiful building, it's incredibly functional, but it never gets done. And so what's the point of that building that is so functional and beautiful, but it never actually gets completed? So the function should dictate the form of the CAs. And as I said, there can be hybrid approaches, but in the end, even when you're doing a hybrid approach, you got to think about that primary function of managing charge risk, and that should be the paramount driver of the design. So moving on to now, we'll get into the next, which is actually the last section of practical tips to assess coverage analysis usability. We've covered a lot of concepts. Some of it, for some folks, you may have been able to just follow us systematically, and it may all sound logical. And for others, it might seem like, oh, we're talking about this and then talking about that. How does it all tie together? And that's probably because you're in different parts of the coverage analysis life and from the development to the use. So let's now try to bring it all together and talk through a few of these tips. Simply to answer the question, is my coverage analysis usable? And I'll say this before we go into the first one, is that there is almost every organization. I say almost, I'd like to say every organization, but I'm sure there's an outlier here or there. But almost every organization has to stop and do a tune-up every once in a while and think about whether what they're doing actually is achieving the function, the goal that they started out with. Is the CA over-formatted? How's the process going? Are you spending so much time on process that you're actually forgetting to check whether the people who use the CA can use it or not? So there's no shame in this. This is what the PIs are doing in their clinical trials, right? Not everything works in a clinical trial. Not everything ends up with a good outcome. You learn things along the way. The scientific method really relies on trial and error, and there's absolutely no shame in a clinical trial having results that don't show efficacy of a drug. Maybe the dose needs to be modulated, or maybe the drug needs to be combined with another drug in order to get it to get the efficacy. But here's the thing: there's nothing wrong, and nothing has gone wrong in a clinical trial if the hypothesis of the clinical trial hasn't been shown. Because not showing the hypothesis is a result and something that the clinical trial is looking for. Every clinical trial that has results, whether it's expected or not expected, is something that the PI learns from, when the sponsor learns from, and then they make it better. And that's in complex systems and complex processes, that's what has to occur. And that's generally what we see across the country, where sometimes you just have to take a beat and think about it and do a tune-up. So the first one, has the CA office, whatever office is developing the coverage analysis, ask the revenue cycle office how the coverage analysis is used for charge separation. This seems like a pretty basic question, but you'd be surprised how often this doesn't happen. Or it may have happened 20 years ago, 15 years ago, 10 years ago, or 5 years ago, but it hasn't happened since. And things change. As Chris talked about, the payment of services and charges has changed over the years. That is something, so it used to be when we started out doing this many years ago, that it was much closer to everything that's covered is paid. But now the reality is that many services that are covered aren't paid by insurance. And these concepts have separated. Coverage and payment as a concept have separated. We'll talk about that in other webinars. I don't want to weigh this down too much there, because using coverage principles is still the best way right now to do your coverage analysis and not confuse everyone. And it's the consistent approach. But it's, how is that revenue cycle office using the coverage analysis? We've had many instances where the coverage analysis process and format has been going on for a few years, but this question hasn't been asked. Then once it gets asked to the revenue cycle office, it was like, oh, well, they actually only use about 5% of the coverage analysis, and that serves their goal, that serves their purpose, and they're passing compliance audits, and everything's fine. And all of a sudden, there is just a wake up call of, wow, okay, maybe we can go a little bit lighter. Maybe we can do the coverage analysis a little bit faster now, because 95% of what we've been putting into the coverage analysis actually isn't used. That leads us to the second question and the second tip. Has the coverage analysis office asked the revenue cycle office which functions in the CTMS they find most useful? Now, what's embedded in this question is that the coverage analysis office is using some type of a CTMS-driven coverage analysis, or might be required, the CA office might be required to fit the coverage analysis format into the CTMS calendar format and so forth. And again, those are decisions that, those are business decisions, operational decisions that so many organizations have made. However, when you're trying to assess when to call it a day, so to speak, on that road to infinity, it's really important to talk to the revenue cycle office to learn what parts of that CTMS-driven CA, what parts of the CTMS is the revenue cycle office using. So we're fans of CTMS, just to put it out there. I mean, CTMSs have done an amazing job in improving subject tracking, enrollment data, the status of the subjects, identifying what arm of the study the patients enrolled on. They're very good at that. They also have many, many other functions. We've sometimes also referred to the calendar. Sometimes the calendars get into the trap of being an all-function calendar. That can work for some organizations. For others, it might not work, or it might be too much. But for example, we've seen revenue cycle offices where when they're queried on, well, what parts of the CTMS are most useful for your job, the most common response that we see is, well, we need to know who the subject is. So we need to have that identified, and we need to know what arm of the study the subject is on, and that's the minimum. That's a great function to use. Then there's the next part, which is in a CTMS calendar, usually on the top, just like in a coverage analysis or a schedule of events, you have a timeline that's going horizontally across your calendar screen. And it'll be visit 1, visit 2, visit 3, visit 4, visit 5. At the point of a study team member writing in January 20th for visit 1 and January 22nd for visit 2, that can be incredibly useful simply as an orientation here. So that is but if the revenue cycle office says, well, that's what we find most useful, and that actually helps us move things along very quickly, that's great. They might say that all of the calendar piece, like all of the detail, well, it just isn't used, and some organizations use it, some of it don't, some don't. But it's important to have this cross information going back and forth. Number 3, are you spending a lot of time to get the codes right in a coverage analysis? So this is many services may have a series of codes that might occur based on what the doctor orders, or some services imagine, for example, pre-meds before a anti-cancer drug is given. There may be a variety of pre-meds that are given. The protocol is calling out pre-meds. The doctor needs to think about them, but the protocol isn't describing what pre-meds are going to be used because that's deferred to the doctor. And again, probably a different session. Yeah, generally, as long as the sponsor isn't paying for those pre-meds or the pre-meds aren't promise-free, those pre-meds are going to be billable to insurance. But here's the thing, is if the protocol isn't dictating what the pre-meds are, and it's the physician discretion, you can't anticipate every possible pre-med that would be used. And you can't anticipate all the codes that might be used, because it's not just the drug codes, but it's the administration codes and the different ways they might occur. So this is something where it's like, if you're ending up spending a lot of time on those codes, trying to get all possibilities there, it might be dragging down the timeline of developing because you're on the road to infinity. So number 4, is your formatting playbook longer than your playbook on institutional decisions about what to bill or not bill to health insurance? I'll tell you this. I'll try to make this super quick. Long time ago, like 15 years ago, we were doing coverage analyses. We had a staff member who was excellent at QA, absolutely wonderful at QA. The person also was a fantastic grammarian and loved accurate punctuation. And but what happened was, for those of you who, as is probably most people listening, if you grew up in the U.S. And you're quoting something, you put the period. The convention is to put the period inside the quote marks, right before the quotation mark. But if you grew up in Canada or the UK or India or Australia or any of the other Anglophone countries, everywhere else in the world that uses English puts the period in a quote outside the quotation marks. Now, anyway, what happened was that was sort of the playbook for the QA that was developed, and that was being assessed as when somebody put the period wrong outside the quotation marks, that was wrong or an error. Well, that language sort of led me to think that a couple of people were failing in learning this, but it wasn't the case. It was just a matter of not prioritizing the risk, and also just making the playbook on format and grammar, punctuations, and so forth more important than the outcome. Of course, we want consistency. Of course, we want orderliness, but you got to have balance, right? So, and that is with 5 too. How do your QA processes describe improvements in consistency and orderliness? We see a lot of times, and again, it's like we have to work on it too as we're doing our own processes. As Chris and I are managing staff, is to avoid improvements are works in progress. Doesn't necessarily mean that something is wrong or something is an error. The real errors are associated with risk, because this is an area where the ultimate function is important, and we have to preserve the language and be careful of our language to talk about risk. As a lawyer, I often see reports and audit results that float around that will talk about errors in the claims review process or in the coverage analysis. And you can imagine, as a lawyer trying to defend, I was like, oh boy, that's a big error rate. But then, you get down to it and it's like, well, no, that was a punctuation point. Number 6, are your CAs spending a lot of time on services that don't generate a charge and services that are not consistently paid for? So there are some things that just simply aren't part of your control for charges, or don't do a charge capture. Again, this is why you should talk to a revenue cycle office if you're doing this coverage analysis, because there's a lot of things that people sometimes put into coverage analyses that actually don't pick up charges. It's complicated enough as it is in charge capture. In my view, you don't necessarily have to put. You start to get into the over formatting territory when you're putting things in that into a CA that don't capture charges. And is your CA process holding up time to activation? This is my last point, and this is that the CA process holding up your time to activation. It's probably because of over formatting. And that might seem counterintuitive, but this is that often drags down and is how it bleeds in. So I'm going to turn it over to Chris to wrap up with this hypothetical.
Sure. Yeah. So if we recall back to the hypothetical with the voice activated lighting in your house, it's very cool, modern, and convenient in theory, but there are some downsides associated with it as well. And the benefits and the downsides need to be assessed, and it also should be assessed: is this a problem? Is this technology creating? Is there a problem here that actually needs to be solved for? And in the voice activated lighting example, sometimes it is just easier to flip on a light switch than to deal with all of the technology and the trappings that come with it. Is this actually do we know what our goal is? What is our goal? Our goal is to turn on the lights. Is this process working us towards this goal? Is this process solving a problem that needs to be solved? And then our last slide here is a little bit glib, but this might be reminiscent to some people with this Rube Goldberg machine to pick up your napkin for you. Is this something that actually needs to be? Do we need to create all these trappings just to do something that might be easier just to do ourselves? So that gets us to the end of the content portion. Just a little bit about us at the end here before I open up to some questions that I have. So the services that Hay Hill Advisors provides, we do strategic advising, research compliance and process assessments, education and training. We develop coverage analyses. We develop Medicare payment analyses, and we do claim scrubbing services. And if you have any questions or any sort of anything to ask us, you can contact us at admin@Hay Hill Advisors. So we just have about 5 minutes left here, and I do have some questions I'd like to get to. The first is, which of the two options, the CTMS-driven CA and the revenue cycle CA, do we see used the most? And I will say that this is kind of a moving target. I think that in general, it's inarguable that things are moving towards the CTMS-driven CA across the country. That doesn't mean that everyone's all the way there, but that is generally the trajectory that we're seeing.
And along those lines, I think that this is where the revenue cycle driven CA, keeping that in mind, the very simple focus there that's there, that should inform if an organization makes a decision to do a CTMS driven CA, the function and the goal of the CA needs to be kept in mind. Although we're seeing more and more CTMS driven CAs, here's the other thing that we're seeing is that most organizations, they experiment with the full functionality of a CTMS and then pull back. Because we've seen a lot of variations, we've seen a lot of hybrid approaches, and we can often tell you where things work and don't work in that interface between CTMSs and billing offices. But I would say that the organizations that achieve efficiency in the CTMS driven CA world don't use all of the functions that the CTMS has available. They use the ones that work for them. And because they don't always work for every organization. I would say this, though, I do think that, if you haven't gone down the path of a CTMS driven CA, be very deliberate as you do it, beta test it. Don't roll it all out at once, because there's no question in my mind, the revenue cycle driven CA, they're quicker to produce. They are, you can make them invisible to time to activation. We've just seen organizations that do revenue cycle driven CAs make the coverage analysis process completely invisible to the time to activation. So if that is your goal, and if that is your big pressure, that's the big holdup, you might say, well, maybe, and you're in the CTMS arena, maybe there's some functions in the CTMS we definitely want. We want the subject identification. We want the timeline across the calendar. But we're going to move forward with a revenue cycle driven CA for budgeting and for planning for billing. You often don't need a full calendar before the first patient is enrolled. So every organization has to figure out its balance.
In the last minute here, I will answer just one more question. So when the CPT codes that are actually charged during a patient visit differ from exactly what is on the CA, is it necessary to update the CA? Or is something like a verbal confirmation with the research billing team sufficient on a case-by-case basis? For example, instead of a lipid panel CPT code being charged, maybe the separate codes that make up the panel are charged. Would you recommend updating the CA with these individual CPT codes, or just verbally confirming those codes to the team?
Yeah, so this is a risk decision that every organization has to make. But I actually think that the most common approach isn't listed, and it's neither of those. And that is to recognize that the codes are starters. And so when you do chart separation, the source of truth is the medical record. And in fact, medical records they have a legal status. Medical records are called legal medical records. Legal medical record for a reason is the source of truth is what's done in documented in the medical record. So if the charge separation team has to go back and ask a doctor every single time that there isn't a code, that a code shows up in charge review that isn't on a CA, you're never going to get through your queue. You have to get comfortable looking at the medical record, looking at the charges, because every single patient will often have a difference. And if the protocol requires that there be one test done, just let's say one lab test, but the doctor thinks the patient needs a panel that includes that as a component, the doctor is going to order that panel. And that is something that, because the doctor's ordering to treat the patient, that's something that the charge separation team has to get comfortable with. Sometimes you do need to make some queries back to the doctor when the medical record isn't clear what's going on. But the CPT codes, they are not the source of truth. They don't dictate which way things go. They're really just starters. And you can never use a coverage analysis as a defense in a claims denial or in a case. Been through this many times with government investigations, and it ultimately is medical record and the claim and the code that goes on the claim.
Yes, and we'll wrap up with this point. I would also bet at the end of the day, you're not receiving any money for either the lipid panel code
Yes, right.
or the individual components. So in reality, it's all a little bit moot. But with that, Ryan, I think we can move to close.
Great. And so thanks, everyone. And again, we are covering some real basic points here, and we're going to build and building blocks get a little bit more complicated and deeper as we go forward. Please look for an email with the next sessions, and you'll get a copy of the recording. And if you have any questions, feel free to email us at education@hayhill.advisors.com, and we'll try to include those questions in our next session. Thanks so much.
Thank you.